Hello, everybody. So in this video, we'll be talking about the epistle reading for this week, which is 1 Corinthians 10, 1 to 13. But I've expanded it and included more text here because I think you really have to have what's happening after the passage to understand what Paul's talking about in these particular verses. So I'm going to be jumping around a lot in this video, so just be prepared for that. And I want to start off actually by jumping down to verse 14, which you see that I've highlighted here. And the reason I want to start there is because, like I said, I think this passage can be kind of confusing if you just sort of dive right into it. And so I think it's helpful to know what Paul's getting at, right? Like that the point of this argument that he's making is what he says here in verse 14, I think. So then, my dear friends, run away from the worship of false gods, okay? So just right up front, I think that's the main point, right? His main point is flee from idols, run away from idols. So if we've got the ending in mind of what he's headed towards, then I think that can help us make more sense of paying attention to how we get there. So, having said that I think that's the main thing that Paul's saying here, I want to go back and sort of give some context leading up to this. So first, just a little bit of the basic context about the city of Corinth itself. So Corinth is located on an isthmus, that is a little strip of land that connected mainland Greece to the lower Peloponnese. So you can see it here on this map um, that Corinth is right here, and you see that there's that little strip of land right there that connects the Corinthian Gulf to the Saronic Gulf on the other side. And so this made Corinth a major shipping port, right? In fact, it was so significant that at one point in the first century, a canal was dug between those two gulfs. You can actually see that right here. This is a modern day picture of the Corinthian Canal, but it was actually first dug in the first century. In fact, just a little side note of history, it was actually dug by people who had been enslaved during the Jewish rebellion in 66 to 70, in which the Roman army came and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. So people who had been enslaved at the end of that war were actually used to dig that canal that connected the two gulfs on either side of Corinth there. Before that, I've read that before that, they would actually have giant logs lined up and they could bring a ship up and sort of roll the ship across the land on the log. So it is actually a really narrow strip of land. So anyway, all this work was done essentially to prevent having to sail around the Peloponnese, right, around this lower part of Greece to just cut off that time right there. Anyway, all that to say that Corinth was an important city with a lot of folks traveling through there. It was a Greek city-state that was destroyed by Rome in 146 BC, and then it was refounded by Julius Caesar as a Roman colony in 44 BC. And so, as we talked about in the video on the Philippians passages and the city of Philippi, Philippi was also a Roman colony. And so Corinth would have a lot of the same features as Philippi would in having all these sort of reminders of Roman power and citizenship there. Paul probably wrote to the Corinthians in the mid 50s of the first century. So by that point, it's well established um, as a Roman colony on Greek soil, but as part of the Roman Empire. Now, all that context is not just sort of interesting historical detail, but I think it helps us understand a little bit about the character of the city of Corinth, especially when Paul is warning them to flee from the worship of false gods or the worship of idols. If you read commentaries on First Corinthians, sometimes those commentaries will make a really big deal of like, oh, Corinth was like Sin City, right? That it was because it was this shipping port and there were so many people coming and going, the morals were just so low, and and there was just all kinds of idol worship and all kinds of immorality and things happening there. Uh, I'm not going to try and claim that that's completely wrong. I wonder if it may be a little overblown. I don't know. I think Corinth, in a lot of ways, was a typical Greco-Roman city of the first century. But having so I don't know that Corinth was exceptional in that way. But like most Greek and Roman cities in the Roman Empire in the first century, from the perspective of a Jewish individual like Paul, they certainly were full of idols, right? I mean, if you ever have the opportunity to visit any of these cities where Paul founded gatherings of Jesus followers, you just see there's just temples everywhere, right? I mean, they're like Dunkin' Donuts here in New England, right? Like there's a temple everywhere. So I've included just a picture of one here from Corinth. So this is a temple. Oops, sorry. Let's try that again. Um, so right here, you've got a temple. And archaeologists, I think there's actually debate about whether or not this is a temple of Apollo or a temple of Poseidon, but they're pretty sure it's one of those two. In any case, you can see here in this picture, and then this one down here is actually the same temple, just taken from the other side there. Um, but you can see in this picture, you see the Gulf right out here, right? You see the body of water. So this and in the picture in this picture here, the city itself would be kind of off to this side, or in this picture it'd be right over here. Is kind of what we might call downtown Corinth, so to speak. The main thoroughfare of the city is right off to the side there. And so all that to say, I'm just trying to give you a flavor of what the city is like. That right as you would come in from the port, you would encounter this large temple of Apollo or Poseidon, and of course it wouldn't have been the only temple to a Greek or Roman god in Corinth. There would have been many others as well, but it was set right there, kind of welcoming you into the city, welcoming you into the main thoroughfare of the city. And honestly, that's not sort of that unusual for a lot of Greco-Roman cities. So all that to say that when Paul is telling the church in Corinth to flee from the worship of false gods, that probably seemed like a challenging task, I would imagine, because they would have been surrounded by it, right? It would have been all around them, just as all of Paul's followers in all of these Greco-Roman cities, that would have been the case for them as well. Okay, so that's a little bit of context about the city itself, and just trying to give you a little bit of flavor of what it would have been like to live in a place like that. Now let's talk about the context of Paul's letter itself, or rather, where this passage falls within the letter. So, why is Paul writing to the church at Corinth? Well, I would sort of summarize it as two sort of basic reasons. The thing that probably prompts his writing is because of the things that he's heard about them, that he's gotten word from others of his partners in ministry about what's going on there, and he doesn't like what he's hearing. And that essentially that problem I would sort of boil it down to describing it as there are divisions in the church, and the reason for the division is primarily a kind of spiritual arrogance, quite frankly. That it seems like, if we can kind of read between the lines of what Paul says in the first few chapters of the letter, it seems like a lot of folks in this church are thinking of themselves as more spiritual than those around them. They're kind of like super spiritual Christians, right? And they're looking down on others around them. But this kind of super spirituality maybe manifests in a way that I don't, maybe would be a little surprising to us in a modern context, or maybe not. I don't know. But it seems like the way that these sort of super spiritual Christians are thinking is that they are so spiritual that what they do with their bodies doesn't matter, right? So you'll notice, if you pay attention throughout First Corinthians, the kinds of things that Paul is addressing tend to have to do with very physical bodily things, right? He's talking about sexual relations, right? He's talking about what you eat and drink, and that's really what comes up in this passage here, is what you eat and drink. And so it seems like a big part of the issue at Corinth is some people are thinking that, oh, because they have this life in Christ that has made them so spiritual, that they're almost like leaving their body behind, that their body doesn't really matter. Um, the other main thing Paul does through a significant part of the letter is simply answer questions. So not only has he heard things about what's going on there, but he's received questions from the Corinthians about living this life in Christ, and he sets out to answer those questions. He actually does that for several chapters throughout the letter. So this section in 1 Corinthians 10 comes in that section of the letter. And Paul's already sort of done the opening where he's kind of addressed these super spiritual people and the divisions in the church, and he's tried to get at that problem. And now he's moved on, and he says, now for the things that you wrote about. I think that's chapter 8, verse 1, if I'm remembering correctly off the top of my head, but I might be wrong about that. But he moves to this section of the letter where he says, okay, now I want to respond to the things that you wrote about. And that's what he's doing here in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Now, again, if we just dive into verse 1 of this chapter, it may not be immediately obvious what it is that they're asking him about, and that's why I think it's helpful to jump down here. Because I think if we actually start with verse 14 and what follows, we begin to see what it is that they've asked him about. He says, so then, my dear friends, run away from the worship of false gods. I'm talking to you like you are sensible people. Think about what I'm saying. Isn't the cup of blessing that we bless a sharing in the blood of Christ? Isn't the loaf of bread that we break a sharing in the body of Christ? Since there is one loaf of bread, we who are many are one body, because we all share the one loaf of bread. Look at the people of Israel. Don't those who eat the sacrifices share from the altar? What am I saying then? That food sacrificed to a false god is anything? Or that a false god is anything? No. But this kind of sacrifice is sacrificed to demons and not to God. I don't want you to be sharing in demons. You can't drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You can't participate in the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Or should we make the Lord jealous? We aren't stronger than he is, are we? So I think if we read between the lines of what Paul's saying here, we can gather pretty confidently that probably what the Corinthians have asked him about is about eating meat that's been sacrificed to idols, or to put it maybe more in their terms, to eating meat that has been sacrificed to a Greek or Roman deity there in the city of Corinth, right? From Paul's perspective, a false god or an idol. And again, just a little bit of context here, we might listen to that and go like, well, what's the big deal? Why don't they just go to the market and get their meat instead of eating meat sacrificed to idols? But it's actually not that simple. That actually temples and priests in the ancient world kind of function also as your butchers, right? In many cases, there is not just a meat market to go to. That you probably it would probably be difficult for you to find meat in a city like Corinth that had not been part of a sacrificial ritual to a Greek or Roman god. That was in fact part of how temples and worship in temples worked, is that if you were going to eat meat, a lot of times the only way you were going to get that was by participating in receiving meat that had been of an animal that had been sacrificed in one of these temples. So to not eat meat sacrificed to idols in many of these cities around the Mediterranean would mean to not eat meat at all. So just a little side note there, that it is actually a significant thing. But maybe what's more important here is that it's interesting that you see Paul says here, what am I saying then? That food sacrificed to a false god is anything, or that a false god is anything? And the answer is no, it's not, right? So Paul's walking a bit of a tightrope here in some ways, because he's saying, well, those false gods, they are false gods, meaning they're not anything. They don't amount to anything. But of course, the Corinthians would probably come right back and say, yeah, Paul, that's what we're saying. If these other gods aren't real gods, then why does it matter whether or not we eat the meat that's been sacrificed to them? They're nothing. And Paul's answer here in this case is, yeah, it may be that those false gods are nothing, but that's still a kind of demonic worship that is being participated in there. That I mean, Paul seems to believe that there are sort of evil spirits associated with those sacrifice, and he wants them to flee from the worship of false gods, right? He wants them to have nothing to do with that, and so he encourages them to stay away from it. In the rest of the chapter, which I did not put on here because it would have just been too much text to include, Paul also goes on to say that it's about conscience, right? And he's like, not your conscience, but the conscience of your brother or sister. That if will you cause them to stumble if they see you eating meat sacrificed to a false god? Will they think you're participating in the worship of that false god and so thereby worshiping that god? So Paul kind of throws actually a couple different arguments at this issue. So that seems to be the main idea that Paul's driving at. So now, having noticed that, let's come back to the actual text for this week and see what Paul has to say and how it connects to what we just heard. So he says, brothers and sisters, I want you to be sure of the fact that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and they all went through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. They drank from a spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Okay, so if at this point you're wondering what in the world is Paul talking about, that's perfectly understandable, right? Because he's doing some interesting stuff here. But basically, he's using the story of Israel as they wandered in the wilderness, waiting to enter the promised land, as a sort of example to the Corinthians. So when he talks about, so he says, all our ancestors, or actually in Greek, it's our fathers, were all under the cloud, and they all went through the sea, right? So we're talking about the people following Moses with the cloud and following Moses through the Red Sea, right? But then he does this interesting thing where he says, they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And they all ate the same spiritual food, and they all drank the same spiritual drink. They drank from a spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. This is really interesting, right? Because you may know these stories from Exodus, and you may be thinking to yourself, I don't really remember them ever going through the Red Sea as being talked about as a kind of baptism, right? In fact, I mean, it's sort of weird, right? Because the Israelites themselves don't get wet. It's really Pharaoh's army that gets baptized, so to speak, and they drown, right? And then this thing about you may remember the story from Exodus and from Numbers, where Moses, God tells Moses to strike this rock with his staff, and water comes out of the rock when the people didn't have any water to drink. So that's what's being referenced here in verse 4. But then Paul goes on to say that the rock was Christ, which is really interesting, right? Because Exodus and Numbers don't make any reference to that at all. It does seem like there were some rabbinic traditions, some rabbinic Jewish traditions that of course, don't connect the rock to Christ, to Jesus, but do connect do have this idea that the rock followed the people and continued to provide water for them, and that was a symbol of God's presence with the people and continuing to provide water for them. So it's possible that Paul is drawing on that kind of tradition here. But we might ask ourselves, well, why does Paul bring up those stories at all in the first place? And I think this is where it connects to the later part of the passage. It seems like that and also connects to that idea of like the Corinthians thinking that they're super spiritual, right? So it seems like what's going on here as we try to read between the lines with these context clues and understand what it is that Paul's addressing. It seems like what's happening is the Corinthians may be reasoning to themselves like, hey, we've got this spiritual food, namely communion, the Lord's Supper, and the spiritual drink, right? The blood of Christ, right? And that we've had this spiritual baptism, right? And so we've done all these very spiritual things, and so because of that, again, that idea, we're so spiritual that what we do with our bodies doesn't matter. And so because we have the spiritual food and drink and the spiritual baptism, it doesn't matter if we eat meat sacrificed to idols. And so I think what Paul's doing here is he's trying to say, no, 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 no. the people of Israel had the same thing, right? They had the same spiritual drink. They, even though they're not taking communion, right? But he's wanting to make a connection, and saying the people of Israel were also had a kind of baptism. The people of Israel also had a kind of spiritual food and drink, and that didn't keep them from falling, didn't keep them from being disobedient. And that's the real sort of key here of what Paul's driving at. So you see, if we continue on in verse 5, he says, however, he's like, despite them having those things, God was unhappy with most of them, and they were struck down in the wilderness, right? So if you remember this story, of course, the this generation never makes it into the promised land. They're struck, they die in the wilderness, right? These things were examples for us, so we won't crave evil things like they did. Don't worship false gods like some of them did. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and they got up to play. So this, in italics right here, is a quotation from Exodus chapter 32, verse 6 specifically. But I've got 1 through 6 here as a reminder of what the story is. So again, remember, this is they've come out of Egypt, and they're making their way to the promised land. But in the midst of that, we have this episode with the golden calf, right? So the people saw that Moses was taking a long time to come down from the mountain. That, he's on the mountain receiving the law from God. They gathered around Aaron and said to him, come on, make us gods who can lead us. As for this man Moses who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't have a clue what has happened to him. Aaron said to them, all right, take out the gold rings from the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me. Which, by the way, remember, they gathered on their way out of Egypt from the Egyptian people. So all the people took out the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He collected them and tied them up in the cloth. Then he made a metal image of a bull calf, and the people declared, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So Moses has gone a little bit too long, and they're worshiping false gods just like that. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf. Then Aaron announced, tomorrow will be a festival to the Lord. They got up early the next day and offered entirely burned offerings and brought well-being offerings. The people sat down to eat and drink, and then got up to celebrate. And of course, that last verse is the part that Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians. So he says, let's not practice sexual immorality like some of them did, and 23,000 died in one day. Let's not test Christ like some of them did and were killed by the snakes, if you remember that story from Numbers as well. So there's just all these allusions to different stories from Exodus and Numbers in here. Let's not grumble like some of them did and were killed by the destroyer. These things happened to them as an example and were written as a warning for us, to whom the end of time has come. So those who think they are standing need to watch out, or else they may fall. No temptation has seized you that isn't common for people, but God is faithful. He won't allow you to be tempted beyond your abilities. Instead, with the temptation, God will also supply a way out so that you will be able to endure it. So really, honestly, Paul's interpretation of these stories from Exodus and Numbers, the story of Israel, and the way that he applies it to his congregation in Corinth is pretty, should at least say creative, right? I mean, first of all, it's interesting because most of his audience is surely Gentile in a city like Corinth, I would imagine. That most of them are probably not Jewish. And yet, despite that, Paul is still saying the story of Israel is your story, that he's inviting them to find their story in Israel's story. And he's even, as we saw in verse 4, reading Christ back into that story in a way that the text itself does not have. But he's saying that these stories serve as an example, as a warning, right, for the Corinthians, that they shouldn't make the same mistake that the people in the wilderness made. And so the big idea here seems to be, like I said, flee from idols. That our fathers, or as this translation says, our ancestors, are an example to us. But I think in some ways what he's really getting at is he's saying, don't think that you're so super spiritual that what you do with your body doesn't matter, right? You all think that basically can do no wrong, right? Maybe they think they're entirely sanctified and that means that they can never trip up, right? Um, but he's saying you all think you're so spiritual that you can just do whatever you want, basically. And Paul's saying, no, that's not the case. He's saying Israel had the same advantages that you have, and yet they still didn't follow what God wanted. And so this passage essentially, and it's despite all the sort of oddness of Paul's interpretation, the sort of complexity of all this context around this story, really the main point is actually pretty simple. It's watch out. It's be attentive. It's keep your distance from idols and from sin. Basically, he's saying, don't play around with that stuff, right? Um, that even that he knows, right, that they're surrounded by all these temples. And I think it's really interesting what he says here in verse 13, because I think this is actually really appropriate. He says, no temptation has seized you that isn't common for people, right? In other words, what the Corinthians are experiencing, this temptation to participate in the worship and all these temples that surround them, is like, yeah, that's common. Like all Paul's churches probably faced that temptation, right? Because they're all living in cities like this, where it would have been a constant. I mean, this all of these acts of worship would have been so much part of the culture, right? It's sort of like asking us to not. How do we avoid the culture that we live in today, right? Whatever particular aspect of it you might have in mind, it surrounds us. We breathe it in. It's like a fish swimming in water. It's so completely around us that sometimes we don't even see it. And I think that's part of what Paul is saying here for the Corinthians. He's saying, look, what you're facing, isn't uncommon. But God is faithful, and He won't allow you to be tempted beyond your abilities. Instead, with the temptation, God will also supply a way out so that you will be able to endure it. Just as He supplied a way out for the generation that wandered in the wilderness. And so this passage ends on a note of hope, despite that most of it is this warning of, hey, don't don't think of yourself as so super spiritual that you can't do any wrong. But it is this message of warning, but it ends on this note of hope that even if you sort of recognize that you are surrounded by these temptations, God will still provide a way out. Even though there's a temple to a different God everywhere that you look, God will still provide a way out. And I think that's a good word for us because, of course, there's all kinds of ways that our own American culture runs contrary to the gospel, right? And we might look around and just see all kinds of things that we go, man, how am I going to live a faithful life in the midst of all of this and in the midst of all these things that American culture worships? Um, but the message that Paul gives is even if you're surrounded by temples of uh, worship to other gods, God will provide a way out. But you have to do your part too to run away from the worship of false